The last thing Hannah Miller owned was small enough to fit inside a kitchen drawer, and the pack was still going to find a way to take it from her. She folded the baby blanket slowly, corner to corner, the way her mother had taught her when Hannah was too young to understand that some instructions were not about neatness, but survival. The blanket was faded cream wool, soft in the middle from years of being held and thin at the edges where the silver stitching had begun to loosen. It smelled faintly of cedar, old lavender, and the little tin trunk beneath her bed, where she kept the few things no one in Reed Hollow Pack had yet thought to charge her for. Hannah told herself the trembling in her fingers was from the morning cold. It was not. The room was barely 12 feet across, tucked above the laundry shed behind the main hall, and the small iron stove in the corner had gone out hours before dawn, but Hannah had lived through colder mornings without feeling this strange hollow pull beneath her ribs. Outside, the pack yard was waking in layers, boots crossing gravel, buckets striking well stone, someone laughing near the stables, the bell over the kitchen door ringing twice, as the bread cart arrived from town. Ordinary sounds. Safe sounds, if safety was something you judged by repetition instead of kindness. Hannah had learned not to expect kindness here. She had learned to move early, speak softly, and keep her eyes lowered long enough for people to forget how young she was, how alone she was, how much she still remembered. Her mother, Lydia Miller, had died 11 months ago in a narrow healer's room that smelled of peppermint oil and rain-soaked wool. Before the fever took the strength from her voice, she had reached for Hannah's wrist with a grip that felt impossible for a woman already half gone and whispered, "Never cut the inner seam." Hannah had thought she meant the blanket would fall apart. Later, after the burial, after the healer's fee was added to the debt ledger, after Alpha Mason Reed told her she could remain with the pack if she proved useful, Hannah had repeated the words so often they became less like a warning and more like prayer. Never cut the inner seam. She did not know why the sentence made her chest ache more than grief did. She only knew the blanket was the last thing that had belonged to her before Reed Hollow started measuring her life in what she owed. $3 for lamp oil. $7 for winter grain. $20 for medicine her mother had not lived long enough to finish. A protection fee. A room fee. A work placement fee. The numbers changed whenever Elder Graham Pike opened his black ledger, but the conclusion never did. Hannah owed more today than yesterday. She always did. She pressed the folded blanket against her chest for one quiet second, just one, because no one could tax a second if they did not see it. Then heavy footsteps stopped outside her door. The knock did not come at first. That was how Hannah knew it was not one of the kitchen girls borrowing thread, or Mrs. Vale asking for help with the sheets before breakfast. Kind people knocked quickly, almost apologetically, because they understood a closed door meant a person had claimed one small border around herself. Reed Hollow officials waited outside until the waiting itself became a command. Hannah set the folded blanket on the narrow mattress and smoothed her palm over the top once, careful not to linger. Then she crossed the room and opened the door. Elder Graham Pike stood in the hall with his black ledger tucked beneath one arm, and two pack guards behind him, both wearing the stiff faces of men who had decided that obedience was easier than thought. Graham was narrow and grey, with a beard trimmed so sharply it looked less grown than measured. He glanced past Hannah into the room before he looked at her face. "Good morning, Miss Miller," he said, as if the words had been copied from a form. "Alpha Reed has asked for an accounting before council breakfast." Hannah kept one hand on the door frame. "I worked 14 hours yesterday. Laundry, kitchen, and West Wing mending." Mrs. Vale signed the sheet. Graham opened the ledger. The pages made a dry sound, like dead leaves dragged over stone. "Your labor credit has been entered. Unfortunately, there are outstanding balances that labor alone no longer satisfies." He turned the book so she could see the columns, though Hannah knew he did not expect her to read them all. He enjoyed numbers most when they were too many to argue with. Room maintenance, $2.70. Winter coal assessment, $9. Healer transfer balance, $36. Pack protection, $12 monthly, unpaid since November. Use of pack well and kitchen fire, $4. Administrative review fee, $3. Hannah looked at the ink, at the careful little lines that had been drawn around her life. Some of those charges were new. They are old charges properly categorized, Graham said. His eyes did not lift from the page. Proper categorization had become one of Reed Hollow's favorite cruelties. It sounded clean. It sounded reasonable. It made hunger into policy and loneliness into debt. Hannah had been 15 when her mother first brought her through the southern gate, both of them carrying one canvas bag each after leaving a town that had never felt like home. Mason Reed had not been alpha then. His father had been alive, softer in voice if not in law, and Lydia Miller had earned a place in the sewing rooms, because no one in 3 counties could mend ceremonial wool the way she could. Hannah had grown up beneath tables, beside baskets of cloth, under the smell of starch and steam, learning that a good seam could hide what the world was not ready to see. After Lydia fell ill, everything changed so gradually that Hannah had not noticed the trap until she was already inside it. A favor became an advance. An advance became a balance. A balance became a condition. By spring, Mason Reed was calling her fortunate in front of the council. Fortunate to have shelter. Fortunate to have work. Fortunate that the pack was willing to carry her mother's expenses after the burial. Hannah had learned then that gratitude could be demanded like rent. Graham tapped the ledger with one pale finger. Payment is required today, he said. Hannah felt the blanket behind her as if it had weight enough to pull the room backward. I have no cash until Sunday. Then we will inventory personal property, Graham said, and stepped across the threshold without asking permission. Graham crossed the room as if he had been there 100 times, though Hannah knew he had never once climbed the narrow stairs before that morning. Men like him did not enter laundry rooms unless they meant to count what was inside them. One guard remained by the door, blocking the hall with his shoulder. The other followed Graham with a canvas collection sack folded over one arm, his eyes fixed somewhere above Hannah's head. She wondered whether he had trained himself not to see people during inventory, or whether Reed Hollow had trained him. Graham began with the shelf by the stove. A blue enamel cup, chipped at the handle. 40 cents, he said. A tin of sewing needles. $1. A pair of winter socks, darned at both heels. 20 cents. Hannah watched each item disappear into the sack and felt something inside her become quieter with every small loss. It was not the value. That was the trick of it. None of these things were worth enough to change the ledger, and everyone in the room knew it. The point was not payment. The point was to teach her that ownership was a privilege Reed Hollow could revoke whenever it pleased. Graham lifted the little bone-handled knife her mother had used for cutting thread. Hannah took one step forward before she could stop herself. My mother used that for work, she said. Graham looked at the blade, then at the ledger. Tools may be applied against household balance. He handed it to the guard. Hannah pressed her fingers together until the nails left pale half-moons in her skin. She did not beg. Begging gave people like Graham a shape they knew how to use. He moved to the trunk beneath the bed. Hannah felt the air leave the room before he even touched the latch. There were only 3 dresses inside, folded flat from years of careful washing, a packet of letters tied with grey string, and the blanket. Graham removed the dresses first, pinching the fabric between 2 fingers. Used garments, minimal value. He reached for the letters. Personal paper has no assessed worth, he said, and tossed them back as if mercy had been performed. Then his hand closed around the folded cream wool. Hannah did not remember crossing the room. She was simply there, close enough to see the loosened silver thread along the edge, close enough to smell cedar and lavender as he lifted it from the trunk. "Not that," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it changed the room. The guard by the door looked at her then. Graham paused. It was the first pause he had given her all morning. He glanced at the blanket again, and something sharpened behind his eyes. "Sentimental items often conceal value," he said. "It has no value to you. Then you will not mind surrendering it." Hannah's throat tightened, but her face stayed still. "Please," she said, and hated that the word came out before she could stop it. From the hallway came the soft click of heeled shoes on the stairs. Vanessa Cole appeared in the doorway wearing a pearl gray morning dress, and the satisfied expression of someone who had arrived just in time to watch another person lose. "What is she hiding?" Vanessa asked. Graham gave a small bow. "A textile item recovered for debt assessment." Vanessa stepped into the room and took the blanket from him before Hannah could move. She unfolded one corner, wrinkling her nose at the worn wool, then smiled when Hannah flinched. "Oh," she said softly. "This one matters." Hannah kept her eyes on the blanket, not on Vanessa's face. "It was the only thing my mother left me." For a moment, the sentence sat in the cold little room with more dignity than anything Reed Hollow had ever given her. Then Vanessa folded the blanket carelessly over her arm. "Then it will make an excellent payment," she said. Graham wrote something in the ledger. The scratch of his pen sounded louder than the kitchen bell below, louder than the boots in the yard, louder than Hannah's own pulse. "Personal textile, pending valuation," he said. "Removed from debtor possession at 7:18 in the morning." Hannah stood beside the open trunk and understood, with a clarity so calm it frightened her, that Reed Hollow had finally taken the one thing that did not belong to them and called it lawful. By 8 o'clock, the great hall had been arranged for council breakfast, though nothing about the room felt like morning. The long tables were set with coffee urns, baskets of biscuits, bowls of butter wrapped in muslin, and plates of sliced apples that had browned at the edges while everyone waited for Alpha Mason Reed to take his seat. Hannah stood near the west wall with the other workers, hands folded in front of her apron, the open space between her and the council table feeling wider than any road she had ever crossed. Vanessa had not returned the blanket to Graham. She had carried it herself through the yard, past the kitchens, past the stables, past 3 young pack members who slowed when they saw Hannah following behind with an empty face and no coat. Now the folded cream will lay on the council table beside the black ledger, a brass scale, 2 stamped payment notices, and the silver seal Mason used when he wanted ordinary cruelty to look official. It looked smaller there. That was what hurt first. In Hannah's room, the blanket had filled the trunk with memory. In the great hall, under the high beams and hanging flags of Reed Hollow, it looked like a rack someone had forgotten to throw away. Mason Reed sat at the head of the table in a dark green jacket, his blonde hair combed back, his expression calm in the practiced way of a man who believed calmness could make any decision appear wise. He did not glance at Hannah when Graham began reading from the ledger. He looked instead at the room, at the elders, at the junior guards, at the kitchen girls pretending not to listen while refilling cups. This was not an accounting. This was a lesson, and every Omega in the hall understood that before the first number was spoken. "Miss Hannah Miller," Graham said, "has failed to satisfy accumulated household and protection balances despite repeated opportunities for labor credit." Hannah stared at a knot in the floorboards near her shoes. She knew that if she looked at the blanket too long, something in her face might move, and Reed Hollow had always been hungry for visible weakness. Graham listed the items taken from her room with the flat patience of a bank clerk. Cup. Needles. Socks. Work knife. Used garments. Personal textile pending valuation. At that, Vanessa touched the folded blanket with 2 fingers, almost lazily. Several people turned to see what had earned her attention. Hannah felt those looks gather and settle on her skin. Mason finally glanced toward the wool. Is there a reason that item was brought before council? Vanessa smiled without showing her teeth. She seemed unusually attached to it. A few quiet laughs moved along the side benches, small enough for people to deny later. Hannah heard Mrs. Vale inhale sharply near the kitchen doors, but say nothing. No one said anything. That was how the pack worked. Silence passed from person to person until it became a wall. Graham adjusted his spectacles. Sentimental attachment may indicate concealed value, alpha. Mason leaned back. Then value should be determined. Hannah lifted her head before she meant to. The words came from somewhere below thought, from the same place that had remembered her mother's hands and the fever room and the warning whispered against her wrist. Please do not cut it. The hall went quiet in a different way. Not respectful. Interested. Vanessa looked delighted. Cut it. She repeated, as if Hannah had offered her a gift. Hannah's mouth had gone dry. My mother told me not to. That was the truth, but it sounded foolish once spoken into a room built to make tenderness seem childish. Vanessa picked up the small sewing scissors from Graham's inventory kit. The metal made a clean little sound as it opened. Well, she said, then your mother must have hidden something very important inside. The first cut was so small that no one in the hall could have mistaken it for damage, if they had not already been waiting to enjoy it. Vanessa slid the tip of the scissors beneath the loosened silver thread at the blanket's inner edge, and snipped once, delicately, almost politely. The sound was tiny, but Hannah felt it in her chest as if something had opened there too. She did not move. If she stepped forward, the guards would stop her. If she pleaded again, Vanessa would slow down just to make the room listen. So Hannah stood beside the wall with her hands folded so tightly her fingers had gone pale, and she watched the last private thing her mother had left her become entertainment for people who had eaten warm biscuits 10 minutes earlier. Vanessa worked with theatrical patience, lifting one seam, then another, drawing the cream wool back from a hidden inner layer Hannah had never seen. For one strange second, there was nothing inside but darker cloth, smooth and almost black, preserved from age by the outer fold. Then the candlelight struck it. A pattern glimmered beneath Vanessa's hand, not bright like jewelry, but deep and cold, the way moonlight looks on a frozen pond. Vanessa stopped smiling. Graham leaned forward. Mason Reed set down his coffee cup without drinking from it. Hannah heard the cup touch the saucer, a small porcelain sound that seemed to travel farther than it should have. Vanessa pulled the wool farther open, and the design revealed itself by inches. A crescent wolf curved around a narrow crown, each line sewn in silver black thread so fine it looked less stitched than grown into the cloth. Around the crest were tiny knots of blue thread, hidden under the seam, arranged like stars. No one laughed now. The silence spread from the council table to the side benches, from the side benches to the kitchen doors, until even the youngest workers near the back seemed afraid to breathe too loudly. Hannah stared at the mark and felt no triumph, no understanding, only a terrible confusion that made the room tilt softly at the edges. She had slept under that blanket as a child. She had carried it through 3 rented rooms, 2 county lines, 1 funeral, and every winter Reed Hollow had made colder than it needed to be. Her mother had washed it by hand. Her mother had folded it at the foot of Hannah's bed. Her mother had said, never cut the inner seam. Not because the blanket would fall apart. Because something inside it had been waiting. Elder Graham removed his spectacles, cleaned them with a handkerchief, and put them back on with careful slowness. "That is not a household mark," he said. His voice had lost its official smoothness. Mason looked at him sharply. "Then what is it?" Graham did not answer at first. An older woman on the second council bench, Mirabelle Stone, rose halfway from her chair, her face suddenly drained of color. "I saw that crest once," she whispered. Mason turned toward her. "Where?" Mirabelle's eyes moved from the opened blanket to Hannah, and whatever she saw there made her sit down again, as if her knees had forgotten their purpose. "In the Northern Registry," she said. "On the sealed page for the Royal Lunar Line." The words did not explode through the hall. They landed quietly, which made them worse. Vanessa's hand slipped from the blanket. The scissors lay open beside the black ledger, useless now, almost foolish. Hannah looked from face to face, searching for some sign that this was a mistake, a cruel trick, another way for Reed Hollow to turn her mother into a debt. But Graham had gone still. Mason had gone still. Even Vanessa, who had never looked uncertain in Hannah's presence, was staring at the crest as if it had spoken her name and found her guilty. Then something warm moved beneath Hannah's ribs, not pain, not fear, something older than both. For the first time in years, the quiet place inside her where her wolf should have been answered the room with a single steady pulse. Mason Reed recovered first, not because he understood what had been found, but because men like him had survived for years by reaching for control before truth could settle. He stood so quickly his chair legs scraped across the floor, and the sound broke the stillness in the hall without easing it. "Enough," he said. His voice was steady, but the knuckles of his right hand had gone white against the edge of the table. "This is an old cloth with an old design. Nothing more." Mirabelle Stone kept her eyes lowered. Graham Pike looked at the crest as though it had made the ledger beside it suddenly dangerous. Vanessa took one small step back from the table, then seemed to realize people could see her retreating and placed her hand flat on the wool instead. Hannah felt that touch from across the room. Not on her skin, but somewhere deeper, in the newly awake warmth beneath her ribs. The feeling was unfamiliar enough to frighten her. Her wolf had been silent since her mother died, not gone, exactly, but distant, like a candle left burning in a closed room. Now it pressed gently against the inside of her chest, alert and listening. Mason reached for the blanket. Hannah moved before she thought, only one step, but it was enough for both guards to shift their attention toward her. She stopped. She had no power in this room. She knew that. She had known it for years. But for the first time, the room knew something too, and that made the floor feel different beneath her shoes. "Alpha," Graham said carefully, "protocol requires that any suspected royal insignia be submitted to the Northern Registry for verification." Mason turned his head slowly. "Suspected is the word you should remember, Elder Pike. Reed Hollow does not send every piece of attic cloth to royal authorities, because an old woman becomes sentimental over embroidery." Mirabelle flinched, but said nothing. Vanessa gave a thin laugh, late and unconvincing. "Of course. It is probably from a costume trunk." Hannah looked at the opened seam. Her mother had not owned costumes. Lydia Miller had owned 3 work dresses, 1 Sunday shawl, a sewing basket, and a patience so deep Hannah had mistaken it for weakness until the day she died. Mason lifted the blanket by one corner. "We will dispose of the item and record the debt credit at fair value." Hannah's breath caught, but she did not speak. She had already learned what begging did in Reed Hollow. It turned mercy into theater. Mason carried the blanket toward the hearth at the side of the hall, where breakfast flames burned low behind the iron screen. He did not hurry. Hurrying would have admitted fear. Every eye followed him. With each step, the warmth beneath Hannah's ribs grew stronger, not wild, not angry, but certain in a way she had never been allowed to feel. When Mason reached the hearth, he raised the blanket, as if the matter were already finished. Then the silver seal on the council table gave a single clear crack. No one touched it. No one moved near it. The sound rang through the hall like a glass tapped in an empty church. Mason froze. Graham stared at the table. A thin line had split the reed hollow seal from top to bottom, right through the stamped wolf that marked Mason's authority. The opened crest on the blanket glimmered once, soft and pale, and the blue knots around it brightened like stars seen through winter cloud. Hannah felt her own name before she heard it. Not spoken aloud, not exactly, but recognized somewhere inside her, as though a door she had never found had unlocked from the other side. Mason lowered the blanket very slowly. His face had changed. The calm was still there, but it no longer fit him. Graham closed the ledger. Vanessa removed her hand from the table. The workers near the kitchen doors stood perfectly still. Hannah looked at the broken seal, then at the blanket in Mason's hand, and finally understood the first piece of what her mother had protected. Reed Hollow had not discovered a valuable object. It had uncovered proof that something in Hannah Miller had never belonged to them at all. The crack in the seal did not fade. It remained across the silver like a wound in a mirror, bright at the edges, impossible to explain away, and every person in the great hall understood that Mason Reed was waiting for someone else to breathe first. No one did. Even the breakfast fire seemed to lower itself behind the iron screen, shrinking into a quieter orange glow, while the opened crest on the blanket held the candlelight, with a patience that felt almost human. Hannah stood near the west wall and felt her pulse slow instead of quicken. That frightened her more than panic would have. Panic would have made sense. Panic belonged to the girl who counted coins under a thin quilt and apologized when she took up too much space in a hallway. This calm belonged to someone Hannah did not know yet, someone standing very still inside her, watching Reed Hollow with clear eyes. Mason turned from the hearth, the blanket hanging from one hand. His gaze moved over the council, over Graham, over Mirabelle, over the workers by the kitchen doors, searching for the safest lie. Before he found it, the front doors of the hall opened. Not loudly. There was no dramatic crash, no shouted announcement, no rush of guards. The doors simply swung inward, and the room changed before anyone entered. The air grew colder by a few degrees, not winter cold, but mountain cold, clean and high and sharp enough to make every false thing in the room feel suddenly exposed. The flags along the rafters shifted though no wind had crossed the hall. One of Mason's guards straightened, then lowered his eyes without appearing to choose it. Hannah looked toward the entrance, and saw 3 royal sentinels step across the threshold in dark traveling coats marked with a silver crescent at the shoulder. Behind them came a man she recognized only because everyone else did. Alpha King Callum Hayes did not wear a crown. He did not need one. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a black wool coat dusted with road frost, as if he had come from very far away, and had wasted no time changing into ceremony. His hair was dark blonde, cut close at the sides, and his face had the stillness of carved stone warmed by living eyes. He looked American in the way old portraits of frontier judges looked American, plain in dress, severe in bearing, built for harsh weather and long decisions. The room bowed around him before anyone bent their knees. Mason took one step forward, then stopped when Callum's eyes moved to the blanket. Not to Mason. Not to the cracked seal. To the cream wool hanging from Mason's hand with the hidden crest open to the room. Something passed over Callum's face so quickly Hannah might have missed it if she had not been watching him, as though the hall had narrowed to the space between them. It was not shock. It was recognition held under discipline. He crossed the floor with the unhurried pace of a man who had never needed to chase authority, because authority followed him. The sentinels remained near the doors. No one blocked him. No one spoke. When he reached the council table, he looked at the broken reed hollow seal, then at Graham's closed ledger, then finally at Hannah. His gaze did not pass over her like the others did. It stopped. It saw the worn apron, the pale hands, the face she had trained for years not to reveal too much. It saw the girl Reed Hollow had made small, and the thing inside her that had just answered a royal mark. Hannah forgot to lower her eyes. Callum did not seem offended. If anything, the corner of his mouth tightened with something almost like grief. Mason found his voice at last. Your Majesty, this is a minor internal matter. Callum did not look away from Hannah. No, he said. The word was quiet, but it ended the sentence Mason had planned after it. Then Callum turned to the blanket in Mason's hand and asked, with a calm that made the entire hall listen harder, who took this from her? For a moment, the question did not seem to belong to language. It belonged to the floorboards, to the breakfast cups, to the cracked silver seal, to every lowered face that had pretended not to see Hannah for years. Mason held the blanket, as if it had grown heavier in his hand. Vanessa looked at Graham. Graham looked at the ledger. No one looked at Hannah until Callum did again, and then the whole room seemed to remember where she was standing. I asked a simple question, Callum said. His voice did not rise. That made it worse. Elder Graham Pike swallowed. The item was collected during a lawful debt inventory, Your Majesty. Callum turned his head just enough to include him. From her room. Graham's fingers tightened around the ledger. Yes. With her consent. The silence that followed answered before Graham could. Hannah felt heat move up her neck, not shame exactly, but the old reflex of being discussed while present. She had lived inside that feeling for so long, she had mistaken it for weather. Callum held out one hand toward Mason. The blanket, he said. Mason hesitated only a second, but everyone saw it. Then he placed the cream wool into Callum's hand with the careful reluctance of a man returning something he had already damaged. Callum did not unfold it further. He handled it as if it were not evidence, but a living memory. One of the royal sentinels stepped forward, a woman in her 50s with silver at her temples and a leather case tucked beneath her arm. Callum looked to her. Archivist Hale. The woman opened the case on the council table and removed a pair of white cotton gloves, a small magnifying lens, and a blue-bound registry book marked with the same crescent symbol as the sentinels' coats. She did not rush. Somehow her slowness made the room more afraid. She studied the crest, the blue thread knots, the hidden inner cloth, and then the stitching along the edge where Vanessa had cut it. This was not made for display, she said. It was made to survive concealment. Vanessa gave a brittle laugh. Or to imitate something important. Archivist Hale looked at her for the first time. An imitation would copy the crown and wolf. It would not know the star count. She touched the tiny blue knots without pressing them. 7 above the crown, 3 beneath the left curve, 1 hidden under the lower seam. That arrangement was used only for the protected descendants of the northern lunar line after the Ashfall winter. Maribel Stone covered her mouth with one hand. Hannah heard someone near the kitchen doors whisper her mother's name. Lydia Miller, Archivist Hale said, reading now from the registry book. Born Lydia Hart in Bellwether County. Listed publicly as a seamstress. Privately commissioned as a household guardian to an infant female of royal descent after the disappearance of the Hartwell branch 23 years ago. Hannah's thoughts emptied so completely that she heard the fire again, the soft pop of wood shifting behind the screen. Lydia Hart. Not Miller. Guardian. Not only mother. Infant female. Hannah looked at Callum, but he was watching her with the careful stillness of someone refusing to take more from her than the truth already had. Archivist Hale turned a page. The child was removed from registry protection during a succession dispute and hidden under a civilian name. If she lived, the child would be 23 this winter. Hannah was 23. The number moved through the room more sharply than any accusation. Mason's face had gone pale beneath its practiced composure. Callum noticed. Did Reed Hollow report an orphaned young woman of uncertain bloodline when Lydia Miller died? Graham opened the ledger, then closed it again. Reports are handled by the Alpha's office. Mason spoke too quickly. There was no reason to report a kitchen worker. Hannah felt the words land, but they did not fold her inward this time. Kitchen worker. Debtor. Omega. Small names used by small people to cover what they feared. Archivist Hale looked at Hannah. Miss Miller, may I ask whether your mother ever gave you another name? Hannah almost said no. Then she remembered a fever room, her mother's thumb moving weakly over her wrist, forming 3 silent syllables she had thought were prayer. Hannah rose, she whispered. Callum's eyes softened. Archivist Hale bowed her head. Hannah Rose Hartwell, she said, and the royal crest on the blanket gave one quiet shimmer, as if it had been waiting years to hear her answer. The name changed the room more completely than Callum's arrival had. Hannah Rose Hartwell did not sound like a kitchen worker standing in a borrowed apron near the west wall. It sounded like a bell rung from somewhere buried, a name with stone beneath it, a name that had waited through winters, ledgers, closed doors, and careful humiliations until the right seam was opened and the right witness was present. Hannah did not feel taller. She did not feel royal. She felt the same worn shoes on the same wooden floor, the same chill at her wrists where her sleeves had thinned, the same ache of wanting her mother alive for one impossible minute so she could ask why love had needed so many secrets. But when Archivist Hale said the name, something inside Hannah stopped apologizing for taking up space. Callum folded the blanket once, not hiding the crest, only protecting the cut seam from Vanessa's careless work, and placed it on the council table between the broken Reed Hollow seal and Graham's black ledger. Then he stepped back. Not far, only enough to make the choice visible. Miss Hartwell, he said, and the room seemed to tighten around the sound. This belongs to you. Say what you want done. Hannah looked at him, startled. Everyone else had looked startled too, though for different reasons. Mason expected command. Graham expected procedure. Vanessa expected rescue from someone more powerful than herself. Hannah had expected, without knowing it, for Callum to decide everything now that the truth had become too large for Reed Hollow to hold. Instead, he had placed the blanket within reach and given the next words to her. It was a frightening kind of respect. Hannah walked toward the table. No guard moved to stop her. The same men who had filled her doorway an hour earlier now stepped aside as if the narrow path between the wall and the council table had become a road no one had the right to block. She passed Mrs. Vale near the kitchen doors and saw tears standing in the older woman's eyes, though Mrs. Vale still kept both hands wrapped around the coffee pot, because habits of service did not break all at once. Hannah reached the table and laid both hands on the blanket. The wool was warm. She did not know whether that was from the hearth, from the crest, or from her own palms finally returning to what had always been hers. The first thing, she said, and her voice was quiet enough that everyone had to listen, is that every false debt in that ledger is reviewed by the royal office. Graham's mouth opened, but Callum glanced at him and it closed again. Hannah looked at the black book. Not only mine. Every Omega. Every worker. Everyone who was told kindness had a fee. A sound moved through the back of the hall, not loud, not even quite hope, but the beginning of people remembering their own names. Hannah turned to Mason. The second thing is that anything taken from my room is returned before sunset. Then she looked at Vanessa. And anything taken from anyone else under the same excuse is returned too. Vanessa's face flushed. Mason said, Miss Miller, you do not understand the burden of pack administration. Hannah held his gaze. My name is not Miller because you allowed it, she said. My name is Miller because my mother chose a safe one. Do not use it like a correction. The room went still again, but this time the silence did not belong to Mason. Hannah looked down at the opened seam, at the hidden work her mother's hands had done in secret by some small lamp years ago. The third thing is that Lydia Hart is entered in the Royal Archive by her true name, not as a servant, not as a debtor, not as a woman Reed Hollow forgot. She protected me. I want that recorded before anything is recorded about me. Archivist Hale bowed, deeply this time. It will be done. Mason's composure cracked in small, polite ways. A tightened jaw, a blink too slow, fingers flattening against the table as if he could press the morning back into shape. Callum finally spoke to the room. Reed Hollow's accounts, property seizures, and bloodline reporting will be suspended pending royal review. Alpha Reed, you will surrender the office seal. Mason looked at the broken silver on the table and seemed to understand that he had already lost it. Hannah gathered the blanket into her arms. It was no longer folded perfectly. The cut seam showed. The crest showed. The damage showed. For the first time, she did not try to hide any of it. By sunset, Reed Hollow looked smaller than it had that morning. Not because the buildings had changed, or because the flags had been lowered from the rafters, or because Mason Reed no longer sat beneath them with the ease of a man who believed the room had been built around his voice. It looked smaller because Hannah could finally see the edges of it. The laundry shed. The yard. The council steps. The kitchen door where she had stood so many mornings waiting to be told what her hands owed before they were allowed to rest. For years, Reed Hollow had seemed like the whole world because it had made itself the keeper of every answer. Where she slept, what she earned, what she owed, what her mother had been worth. Now royal sentinels moved quietly through the offices with sealed satchels and calm voices, gathering ledgers, payment slips, inventory records, and reports that had never been sent. Graham Pike sat at a side table with Archivist Hale beside him, reading entries aloud in a voice that grew smaller with each page. Mrs. Vale and two kitchen girls carried returned belongings through the hall, not only Hannah's cup and needles and little work knife, but shawls, boots, family rings, a child's wooden horse, a Bible with a pressed flower inside, things Reed Hollow had swallowed so gradually their owners had almost stopped expecting them back. Hannah watched from the open doorway with the blanket folded in her arms, the cut seam turned inward now, not hidden, only protected. She had thought the return of it would feel like the end of something. Instead, it felt like standing at the first page of a book she did not yet know how to read. Callum Hayes came to stand beside her without crowding her space. He had removed his road coat, and in the softer light of evening he looked less like the force that had entered the hall, and more like a man who knew the cost of arriving after damage had already been done. For a while, he said nothing. Hannah found she trusted that more than she would have trusted comfort offered too quickly. Beyond the yard, the western sky had turned the color of warm grass over the bare trees, and the air smelled of chimney smoke, damp leaves, and the first cold promise of night. Archivist Hale told me my mother will be entered under her true name, Hannah said. She said the protected child record will be amended too. Callum nodded. It should have been done years ago. Hannah looked down at the blanket. She saved me with something as ordinary as thread. There was nothing ordinary about that, Callum said. The words were simple, but they settled gently, without trying to own her grief. A servant came from the kitchen carrying a tray, and stopped awkwardly when she saw them. On it sat a cup of tea, a bowl of stew, and a heel of bread wrapped in a clean napkin. Hannah almost stepped back out of habit. Callum took the tray instead, set it on the low stone wall beside her, and did not touch the food again. "No one will charge you for warmth here," he said. "No one will charge you for rest." Hannah looked at him then, really looked, and saw not a rescuer demanding gratitude, not a king turning her pain into a ceremony, but a witness who understood that being given a place was not the same as being owned by it. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you decide slowly," he said. "You may come north for verification and protection. You may choose another guardian household while the archives are restored. You may keep the name Miller, claim Hartwell, or carry both until one feels true. None of that has to be decided tonight." The mercy of that nearly broke her more than the morning had. Hannah sat on the stone wall, because her legs suddenly felt tired in a way pride could no longer disguise. She placed the blanket across her lap and traced the seam her mother had hidden so carefully, the line between before and after, between the girl counted in debt and the woman finally counted by name. Across the yard, Mason's office seal was carried away in a velvet pouch, split cleanly through the center. No one cheered. Hannah was glad. This did not need cheering. It needed quiet. It needed records corrected, doors opened, names restored, and people allowed to breathe without owing for the air. Callum remained standing beside her, close enough to guard, far enough to let the silence belong to her. Hannah lifted the tea with both hands. It was warm, plain, and real. For the first time since Lydia Miller had died, Hannah did not feel as if her life was something she had to hide in a trunk before morning came. The blanket had not brought her a crown. Not yet. Maybe not ever in the way stories promised. It had brought her something better to begin with, her mother's truth, her own name, and a road north that no one in Reed Hollow had the power to close.